One of the pleasures of being an artist is that you don't need an excuse to go out in the fresh air. But in weather like this, the only problem is that the paint dries out rather quickly. And talking of problems, having watched people over a period of time at various painting workshops and classes, I've noticed that a lot of them experience very similar problems. At first glance, it's not always obvious why, even though in some cases they've watched me run through the correct procedure step by step and seem to be copying my actions. But on closer inspection, it's usually subtle differences in technique which cause the problems. In many cases, the differences aren't so subtle. Some problems result from using too much or too little paint, some from too much or too little water, but many stem from choosing the wrong brush for the job. While all these things contribute to the problems, it's in the area of brush control that most painters fail to grasp what's required, which is why I think it's worth studying in greater depth. My objective here is not to paint lots of pretty pictures for you to admire, but to give you a real insight into what's needed to produce more consistent results, because I'm sure I can help you to produce more satisfying paintings simply by using better or more appropriate watercolour brush techniques.
Art is very much like golf, in as much as you can watch a professional in action, then carry out what you believe is the same action yourself, yet the results are quite different. In both golf and art, you start off with a blank sheet and much anticipation, then halfway through it all goes wrong and you wonder why you ever started. The similarity doesn't end there. Both painting and golf require a calm, planned approach, the correct grip, the right tool for the job, sound technique, a smooth stroke, good timing, and sufficient knowledge to enable you to take the right course of action when things go wrong. If you want to improve, the answer is in your own hands, and as we all know, it's no secret, it's simply practice. But it's no use practicing the same mistakes over and over again. The important thing is to know what to practice.
You probably find that when a demonstrating artist visits your art club, he or she will talk as they paint, but not explain in detail how they hold the brush and at what angle, what direction it needs to be moved, the amount of water, the strength of pigment, the real nitty-gritty of how to paint, because the object is to demonstrate expertise and painting skills in an entertaining way, so the watching throng only receives part of the story. Like most professional painters, during the painting process many of my actions are instinctive and seem so trivial and don't merit a comment. But often it's these small actions that make the difference between success and failure. If a demonstrator described every minute action, the audience would more than likely fall asleep. In my case, they often do. It would be rather like watching one of those awful amateur holiday movies that our friends and relations sometimes punish us with, where they keep describing the obvious. Even so, when it comes to painting, it's all too easy to miss small points that make a crucial difference. Let me give you a small example. After dipping my brush into the water pot, I never put it straight onto the paper. Even if I'm chatting away, I automatically touch the brush on the rim of the water pot, or on the palette, or on the piece of kitchen roll in my hand, to prevent surplus water from dripping onto the paper and making everything too wet to control. When you're new to painting, this is the kind of apparently trivial thing that nobody ever tells you. Whatever size and shape of brush you use, certain important principles apply, and I'd like to work through these with you so that you'll be able to choose the right tool for the job in hand and know how to use it. You won't need all these brushes when you start painting in watercolour, but I just wanted you to see what's available. I've put all the brushes you're likely to need together, plus a few accessories that can be used in conjunction with brushes, or in some cases as an alternative. Although we're concentrating on brush techniques, any implement that assists in the painting process is worth considering, which is why I've included these extra items. This isn't a complete selection, but most of the more commonly used brushes are here. If you're a new painter, buy 3 or 4 of the most useful brushes to start with and add to your collection later, preferably when you've had a chance to try out any brushes you're thinking of buying. As a basic starter set, I would recommend a rigger, a medium round, say 5 or 6, and a 1-inch flat, which in metric terms is 25mm.
As far as quality is concerned, it usually pays to buy the best brushes you can afford, especially where round sable brushes are concerned, because they seem to retain their springiness better and the hairs seem to slide smoothly over the paper with a luxurious feel, like an ice skater gliding over the ice. Having said that, there are many less expensive brushes on the market which are quite acceptable. Whatever brush you choose, it should hold its shape nicely when dipped into clean water and shouldn't splay out with the hairs separating. If it doesn't consistently regain its shape, don't use it.
Now let's run through the more commonly used brushes, and we'll run through them in detail later.
The hake. These are fairly inexpensive goat hair brushes. The 2-inch or 50mm is a handy size, and the larger 3-inch or 75mm one is ideal for damping the paper. The 1-inch or 25mm flat. If you find this too large to handle, try a 3/4-inch or 19mm one. This doesn't have to be an expensive purchase as long as you buy one that retains its shape. Some poor quality ones seem to splay out, leaving gaps in the bristles as soon as you dip them in water, which renders them useless. Squirrel mop wash brushes are suitable for both thick or thin brush strokes. Large round sable brushes like this one are quite expensive. If you're new to painting, you may wish to experiment with a cheaper synthetic one to start with. Medium round brushes are available in various sizes and qualities. Even a top quality number 7 or 8 shouldn't be too expensive.
Small round brushes are fairly inexpensive and useful for detail work. Personally, I use the rigger because I feel it's more versatile and they're not very expensive. I prefer using these to a small round brush because for me the longer hairs produce a finer and more controlled line. The stiff bristle brushes are more often associated with oils and acrylics, but you'll find many uses for these, as I'll explain later. Palette knives are normally associated with acrylics and oil painting, but they can be useful for certain watercolour techniques. The marking and scraping tools come in all shapes and sizes, and we'll be investigating these as we go along. A garden spray is ideal for dampening the paper or freshening up stale paint on the palette, although I often use a decorating brush for both these jobs. Sponges can be used to supplement your brushstrokes or replace them in certain cases, and can also be used for mopping up excess water, although I hope by the time you finish this tape this won't be necessary.
The best advice for selecting which brush to use is to choose the right brush for the job in hand. Once you're accustomed to the various brush strokes that are possible with each brush, the choice should become automatic. Before deciding which brush to use, always consider the shape of the object you're painting and its general bulk, and make your choice to suit. If you're painting a rounded object, the chances are a round brush will fit the bill. If you need large squarish shapes, a flat brush comes to mind.
As far as size is concerned, if you want to achieve a loose painting style, get into the habit of simplifying things at the drawing stage. Then use the largest brush you can handle, and this will prevent you from putting in too much detail. It obviously makes sense to use large brushes for the broad areas and smaller brushes for the finer work. Some people take the word watercolour too literally and use lashings of water as if it's going out of fashion. Control is what we should be seeking in our brushwork, and this is very difficult to achieve if you're too liberal in your use of water. On the other hand, too little water can also be a problem, so let's look at the use of water more closely. You'll always have problems if you use a dripping wet brush straight from the pot. To avoid these problems, tap the brush on the water pot or pull the bristles across the top of the jar or bucket to release the excess water. Then touch the heel of the bristles on a piece of kitchen roll before putting it onto the palette or paper. Now the bristles are moist but not dripping, and they're ready to accept the pigment. Pull a little water onto the surface of the palette, wipe a moist brush into the paint and pull it into the water and mix it well. You can increase the amount of water or pigment at this point, but the main object is to retain control. If you use too much water, it runs down into the edge of the tray, so you need to keep the mixture just solid enough to control it. Having loaded the brush, it's a good idea to pull it across the palette to get the feel of the brushstroke you're about to make. This also helps to smooth the bristles, which may have been disturbed when you mixed the paint. And as the brush slides across the palette, it's an opportunity to see whether or not it's correctly loaded.
If the strength of colour or tone is crucial, perhaps in the early stages of a painting, test it on a piece of scrap paper. Make sure this is a similar type of paper to the one you're using for the finished painting. Not any old scrap with a totally different surface or weight, because this won't give you a helpful comparison. Do use 2 water pots, one for cleaning the brush and one for mixing with paint. Trying to do this with one pot of water can only result in muddy colours.
You wouldn't try to clean your car with one bucket of water, would you? So try not to do the same thing to your paintings and they'll come out a lot better. Now we come to the most vital aspect of the painting process. A creative mind and a gift for composition and colour are of no value if you can't translate your thoughts in graphic form. To do this successfully, it's important to select the right brush, hold it correctly and use it at the right angle with the correct hand action. Failing to master these basic steps is bound to cause you problems. Apart from decorating the house, many new painters haven't held a brush since they were at school and have spent a lifetime using pens or pencils. The action of using these is ingrained into everyone's subconscious, so when you start painting, it's perfectly natural to hold a paintbrush in the same way and use it like a pencil. To become a proficient painter, you need to move away from this action and adopt other ways to handle the brush.
Each brush should be held gently but firmly in a way that allows you to make a smooth stroke. For some brushes, a dart thrower's grip, where the handle rests on the fingers rather than being tightly held by them, is usually more effective than the pencil holder's grip, because it encourages you to let the bristles flow over the paper. In many ways, the type of action employed is just as important as the grip, because we're all physically different, so inevitably what works for one person may not work for another. The crucial thing is how the bristles travel over the paper.
Whatever brush you use, let the bristles do the walking. In other words, don't try to force the bristles in a direction that exerts pressure against them and causes an untidy stroke. You need a smooth, controlled movement that allows the bristles to run across the paper rather than stumble. The bristles will enjoy it more, and so will you. Pull the handle along the line of travel and ensure the bristles follow the handle with a smooth, relaxed stroke. Don't push against the bristles or work them sideways, so the smooth flow of the bristles is disturbed. There are some exceptions to this, like when you deliberately need to use a slightly circular motion with the brush, for example to paint foliage, and we'll look at this later. Move the whole arm, not a wristy or dabbing motion, just stroke the brush across the paper. In sporting terms, it's a stiff wrist tennis style stroke, not a flicking, wristy badminton action. Let the bristles follow the shape of the object, or in landscapes, the slope of the terrain you're painting, rather than dabbing aimlessly at the paper without thought.
The main reason for adapting our brush movements to the shape of the object we're painting is that anywhere the paint overlaps and leaves a darker band, or anywhere the paint fails to cover the paper, leaving a lighter strip, the shape of this lighter or darker band will accentuate the shape of the object or terrain you're painting and help to emphasize the shape you're trying to suggest. Another important point is to select the paper surface that suits the subject. If you want fine detail, it's no use working on very rough textured paper. If a loose look is required, a smooth paper may not give you the broken colour you need. Try all of your brushes on different surfaces to see how the resulting brush strokes vary.
The type of paper surface and how the brush is loaded obviously affects the appearance of your brushstroke. On very rough textured paper, you may need to load the brush with a little more water, otherwise the tooth or roughness of the surface produces a speckled dry brush effect, which is fine if that's what you wish to achieve, but not if you want a nice smooth finish. The brush needs to be loaded sufficiently for the paint to be able to work its way down into the gaps in the textured surface when you want to produce solid areas of colour. On not pressed or smooth paper, the bristles have an easier passage, so the brush can be less heavily loaded. One of the most common pitfalls and one to avoid is applying a weak watery mixture to a damp surface, because apart from resulting in insipid looking paintings, this can cause pools of water to settle and cause backgrounds or cauliflowers.
Each brush can be used in a variety of ways, so it makes sense to consider them individually. In many cases, you can produce similar results with different brushes, so practice using all your brushes in different ways. For painting large areas or for damping the paper initially, large brushes are essential. But don't overload them with water, otherwise your paper will become sopping wet and you'll have to wait quite a while before starting to paint on it. Most watercolourists start off a painting using large brushes to establish the main areas and work through to the smaller ones for the finer detail.
An awful lot of people say they're frightened of using the hake, but once you get used to it, it's a very useful brush. It can be used in a similar manner to the 1-inch flat and with the same techniques. I find it really useful. The best hakes to buy are the ones with this sort of slot in the side here and the stitching across the front, because they seem to come to a nice narrow sharp edge when they're damp. It's essential not to overload the brush with water, because if you take it straight from the water pot to the palette, it can soak up a huge amount of pigment and become totally uncontrollable. This is probably one reason why they're not popular with some people. I only immerse the bristles completely in water at the start of each painting session, or when I'm rinsing it out to change to another colour. Then after tapping the brush on the rim of the water pot to remove the drips, I squeeze out excess water with a piece of kitchen roll before picking up the paint from the palette. Once painting is underway, I only dip the ends of the bristles in the water, and rather than squeezing out any excess water, I lightly press the heel of the brush onto a piece of kitchen roll, which takes some of the moisture out of the upper part of the bristles near the handle, but leaves the lower section still damp. This is the part which is mostly used to pick up and apply the paint. Using the hake in this way allows you far more control over it, and takes the fear out of it for most people.
When damping the paper or applying large washes, as you would for a sky, hold the handle in a fairly upright position, and while keeping a stiff wrist, use long flowing horizontal strokes. This is the ideal stroke for painting graduated washes. Remember not to go straight from the water pot to the paper when diluting the colour. Add water to the paint mixture on the palette instead, and once you've made a good definite stroke, try to avoid going back into it again. For painting land masses like hills, fields and banks, curving strokes are used to avoid a flat look. Here the brush is held at about 45 degrees to the paper, and the brush strokes are swept over the paper as if they're being wiped over the fields themselves, following the terrain. Blend various colours on the paper during this process for added interest. Remember that once you've made a brush stroke on the paper surface retains the moisture, so any subsequent application of colour can be slightly stronger because the dampness of the paper will soften it. Beginners often make their initial brush strokes too wet, and they fail to wait for the water to soak into the paper properly before applying the next brush load. If this is also too watery, it can result in the colours merging on the paper and becoming muddy.
For painting hedges or foliage, use a circular dabbing technique with a dry mixture of paint. So we start off with the light colour first, a nice yellowy colour, and we use the corner of the bristles and do this circular dabbing motion. So we leave little gaps here and there, as you can see. This initial layer of light colour is allowed to dry a little, and then layers of darker paint can be built up to give variations of colour and texture. Now as we go in there, you see we're leaving some of the light patches showing and some of the gaps still in evidence because we want to give a nice rough effect to the thing. So simple dabbing circular motion like that, and you see how the brush curls up at the corners when you do that. Now there's no way you can get this effect if you've got lots of water in the brush, so you need to have the mixture very dry, and as you can see you pull the colour across the palette and there's hardly any water there. If you put lots of water into the hake, it's very difficult to control and it picks up a lot of paint. So we keep the brush moist but not soaking wet. Okay, now we can put some darker colour back into that hedge. So we're just touching the paper here and there, leaving gaps and then mixing the colour in. A little bit of red here and there. Vary the colour for added interest. Now if you keep banging away at the paper with the colour, it's all going to merge in and it's going to be absolutely useless because you'll just get a big splosh of mixed colour. So you need to let that dry in just gently, and when it's almost dry we can go back in again with some stronger colour. So 2 or 3 layers is probably enough, and we mix in the final stroke of colour with a bit of blue and a bit of red and a touch of brown in there, and then we can go back into that. It needs to dry just a little bit longer before we start. Incidentally, if you need to damp this brush during the course of this operation, don't dip it straight into the bucket so it gets all sopping wet again. Just dip the little corner into the water and feed that into your palette, so the palette is moist but not swimming in water.
The heel of the bristles is used to produce the effects of weeds and tufts of foliage using a pressing action. Here a dry mix of paint is used and the action produces a curl in the bristles. But as only the heel of the bristles makes contact with the paper, it won't affect the outcome. This method can be used first on a damp surface where some merging of colour will occur. If repeated as the paper dries out using a stronger mixture, the darker, more distinctive marks retain their shape. When the surface is drier still, lightly pressing the tips of the brush or the curved heel onto the paper will produce light horizontal bands of grassy stems.
If you find your hake doesn't work exactly the way mine does and you can't get that little curve on the end, just put it in the water, get rid of the excess water and squeeze out the excess from the bristles, and you'll find those bristles at the end will naturally curl up like that, so you can dab them on the paper. If you find the effect of this weed inducement rather too severe, take another brush and some clean water and just soften the whole effect. The 1-inch flat is one of the most versatile of brushes. Personally, I prefer it to the 3/4 inch or the 1/2 inch flats because although it's quite large to handle, provided you load it with paint properly and don't have it dripping wet, it's easy to control. It can be used in a similar way to the hake, and once again, water content is the key. Also important is the angle of the brush to the paper.
When you first use the brush, immerse the bristles completely in water and tap them on the side of the water pot to remove the drips. Pull a small amount of water across your palette and work a little paint into it. As with all brushes, ensure the brush is a good shape before taking it to the paper by pulling it across the surface of the palette. This action also confirms that you have the mixture right.
By the way, when referring to the movement or action of the brush hairs, for simplicity, I tend to use the term bristles, whether the brush is made using Kolinsky sable, red sable, nylon, squirrel, goat hair, or a synthetic substitute. Because I want the bristles to move smoothly, I pull the brush across or down the paper. If I need an upright stroke, I move my hand in a position that allows me to pull the brush because I don't want to push against the bristles and disturb the shape. Even a curved stroke is done as a pulling movement with a handle at about 45 degrees. To control the brush nicely, I rest the bristles on the paper and gently move the brush to create the thickness of stroke I want. For a really fine line, I move the brush backwards and forwards across the palette to smooth the chisel edge on the bristles. Then, holding the brush more upright, I touch the edge lightly on the paper. To produce a slightly shorter line, the brush is tilted slightly and just the end of the chisel edge is touched on the paper. To create bands of colour of varying thicknesses for fences, etc., place the brush on the paper and pull it sideways to make a mark of the appropriate thickness. This enables you to paint the fence posts, the fine wires or horizontal wood slats and spiky stems projecting from the top of the hedge. It's obvious that if you overload the brush with a weak watery mixture, these techniques won't work because the paint will be too runny.
When it comes to painting foliage, a corner of the bristles is used and a dry mixture of paint. In this case, a vertical dabbing motion is employed, disturbing the bristles deliberately to obtain the right effect. A similar approach can be adopted for tufts of grass, again using the corner of the bristles and a dry mixture of paint. Here, the brush is pulled briskly up and away from the dry surface of the paper, leaving a ragged edge. Individual stems can be touched in using the chisel edge of the bristles, holding the brush upright. This brush is ideal for larger washes and for painting the main land masses, and you'll probably find it a lot easier to control than the hake.
Many people paint fields and hills in a very flat, uninteresting fashion through incorrect use of the brush, which is why their paintings lack conviction. To achieve a three-dimensional effect on flat paper, the brush strokes must be used to emphasise the shape and form and the tonal contrast between different areas. In some cases, graduating the colour to give a convex or concave appearance. An umbrella is a good subject for illustrating this. Drawn as an outline, it looks totally flat. Introduce some suitable brushstrokes and variations in tone, and it's transformed into an object with depth. To make this clearer, let's simulate the effects of light on hills and fields by arranging some cushions and pillows to represent an area of undulating landscape. Now let's throw a cloth over the top to smooth out the shapes. Now you can readily see how the light emphasises the undulations and throws the various humps and bumps into sharp relief. In the actual landscape, these will show up as contrasting tones and shadow areas, which vary according to the position and the curvature of the surface in relation to the light source. You can see that just like in the real landscape, the flatter surfaces that face the sky receive a lot of light, so they're lighter, and the curved surfaces are lighter at the top and generally darker at the bottom.
When it comes to painting scenery like this, the action of the brush can be used to recreate the shapes and slopes that appear in nature. The brush handle is held at about 45 degrees and the brush pulled over the slopes and hollows, following the contours of the terrain. For added interest, the colours are blended on the paper as well as the palette. Where the land comes to a boundary, the flat edge of the bristles can be pressed a little more firmly onto the paper to give a clear edge. For distant river banks, the brush is kept horizontal and a slight downward movement creates a bank of the appropriate depth. If you allow this to dry out a little, some areas can be overpainted darker to emphasise shape and form. If you leave a narrow horizontal gap and damp the paper below with a strip of clean water, further vertical brush strokes can be blended into this to give the impression of reflections. Using the chisel edge to the bristles and a downward or slanting movement of the brush held at about 45 degrees, distant hills and mountains can be painted very quickly and easily. Painting wet on dry allows you to make a crisp outline at the top, and the firm downward stroke, ending in a little extra pressure, forms a darker lower edge to indicate both a level horizon and a suggestion of a hedge or even a rocky shore. All the time, the colours are blended on the paper for added interest. Try to develop variety in the shape and bulk of your mountains and background hills. Too often, new painters produce uniform mounds on the horizon which resemble either ice cream cones or sometimes identical rounded shapes reminiscent of a hot day on Bournemouth Beach. In each case, the problem is too much uniformity and lack of variety. Balancing the shapes is the key, with perhaps a large one offset or balanced by two smaller ones, preferably in varied colours or tones and shapes, and possibly overlapped for added interest. Variety is also essential when painting foreground stones and clusters of rocks. To indicate in a very loose manner small stones on the shoreline, the brush is loaded with a strong dry mixture of paint. If the brush is used flat to the paper with a brisk sweeping motion, it will leave small speckles of paint standing proud on the rough surface. Larger rocks can be painted by matching the brush strokes to the shapes. So for large round rocks used a curve stroke, and for smaller rounded rocks, the corner of the bristles. If the rocks are solid and square, use a vertical stroke with a damp mixture to start with, and finish off with more dry brushwork. A brush of this size is ideal for painting quite large washes, and its shape and bulk make it ideal for sky painting, summer foliage and the sea. Be careful when buying these brushes because some inexpensive ones seem fine until you start painting with them. Then they often lose their shape. On the other hand, a good quality sable will last for years if you're careful and is a great pleasure to use.
This one has a rounded end to the bristles, rather like a mop, and I prefer this type to the pointed ones, which can encourage you to try and paint too much detail. All my general comments on holding and moving brushes apply to this one too, but you need to be aware that a brush of this size holds a lot of water, so remember this when you're loading the brush and don't overdo it. Let's try a straightforward stroke. Place the brush on the paper and pull it across the paper. As usual, the bristles follow the handle. Nice, even stroke. If we do a vertical stroke, place the brush on the paper, and there we are. Rough paper, you get these little speckly highlights, which isn't such a bad thing. Now for pulling the brush up, turn the hand round like this, place the brush on the paper and then pull up like so. You'll find that doing it this way you've got much more control over the brush. The bristles are sliding over the paper. Lots of people try to put too much detail in with these brushes, and although this one goes to a reasonable point, it's not terribly pointed, but you can still make a fairly thin stroke with it. Like so, turn the hand round, do it that way, this way. For this sort of movement, right to left if you're right-handed, you can always turn your hand like that and pull the brush across the paper like so. Here are two brushes with similar shapes, although the larger one has more flexible bristles. The squirrel mop isn't a highly popular brush, but it deserves to be. You can purchase a reasonably large one for not much more than the price of a good medium round sable. Because of its odd shape and the fact that it's ideal for subjects that require both thick and thin lines, it's very useful. When you first use these brushes, dip them in the water and just pour them into shape. You can see you get a very nice point on the end of the brush there, and this is quite useful. See how this brush operates. Get a nice watery mixture there. We can pull the brush across the palette just to get a nice shape to it, and you'll find that you can do a nice broad stroke, you can do a nice thin stroke with less pressure. Broad, thin, very thin. Now the beauty of this brush is that it enables us to do a stroke that starts thin and gets thick. So we can get this sort of one stroke effect for leaves, maybe 2 strokes, and you can see the possibilities here because it lends itself beautifully to doing these little curving strokes for flowers. You can just touch in a little bit of colour afterwards just to make them more interesting, and this has a lot of possibilities for flower painters. So we can utilise this dual personality of this brush in that you can do such fine lines. As you can see, it's quite a versatile brush and you can get some interesting shapes. We can also use the brush on its side like this, so we hold it flat to the paper and then we can get a solid line, maybe distant trees. We can pull it up like so to get the effect of a fir tree. And you can see on dry paper we get the same effect we can do with some of these other brushes where you're disturbing the bristles but it creates this nice rough edge along there. Don't forget, when you do that sort of thing, you can always go back in afterwards and add a bit of more interest and excitement. Of course, with this brush we can also put in a nice thin stem and then pull out our fir trees and let them blend into the paper like this. When you do that, you obviously shape the point on the palette, and then you can either pull the stem down like so and work the colour out like that, or you can turn your hand over, just shape the brush, turn your hand over and pull it up that way to get the same thing. Obviously, if you want the branches to stay there, you do it on dry paper. If you want them to blend in, you do it into the wet mixture. So for larger ones, we can obviously come up like this and pull our tree out so, releasing the pressure as we go. The brush here is held at 45 degrees roughly, and you can see you could paint most of a tree with this because if you get rid of all the paint off the palette, sorry, if you get rid of all the paint from the brush as far as possible, just get rid of lots of it, we can now pull out some quite fine branches like so. Now I pull this brush backwards across the palette like this, and we're making this nice shape to the brush so we get this excellent point on the end. Now we can suggest our figures, so we want just a little suggestion of a head there and body there, that's our chap, and then perhaps our lady can be turning to look at him. Give her a little bit more hair, and there's her arm down there, and that's where the little point of the brush comes in quite nicely, because you can see that goes to a nice point. We let the feet disappear there. Oh, there's a little dog here somewhere. I'm not very good at dogs, don't understand them, but we'll make a little suggestion of a dog here. I'll just mix up a touch of red into that mixture. We'll give the chap a nice red jumper. So we just all we need to do here is suggest what he's doing. So I think he's got his hand in his pocket there, and his shoulders are slanting, and that other hand's in its pocket. So the point of the brush is very handy there for that. Just pour that brush in, very little water, and we can give the chap some blue trousers here. We're just suggesting he's walking down the road, so we don't want too much detail. In fact, we can use the same colour to slot in a bit of hair on that side of his head. Nice suggestion of a top on the lady. There's a little arm there. I think she's got her arm around the chap. Isn't that nice? Now this is ideal for buildings, this little brush, because you can get right up into these little tiny areas and pull out a nice bit of colour. Just let that blend in. I'll damp the side of the building there, and just to add a bit more interest there, you can guide that nice pointed edge, and yet you can turn it over and get lots more colour into the thing purely by turning the brush over sideways. So you've got the benefit of the point and that broad edge, which is brilliant. All the things I've said about this sport brush apply to the large squirrel, because obviously it's a similar shape but just larger, and you can use it in much the same way. They're both very versatile brushes. Now this big brush holds a lot of water, as you can see, so if you take that straight to the paper you'll have a lot of problems. So dip it in the water, get rid of the surplus, if necessary just wipe it on the tissue, and you can see you get quite a nice point on there. If you want to do a fine stroke, rest this part of your hand on the paper, and then you can use your fingers as a further rest, hold the brush on the paper, and then you can pull it up like so. The lighter you press, the thinner the line becomes, and the heavier you press, obviously the thicker it is. But this allows you to have quite a shaky hand but still control the brush, because you've got a nice solid base for it, and it applies whether you do an upward stroke or a sideways stroke. This is also true for the rigger and all the other fine brushes that you might use. One other thing this brush is good for is for flopping the colour onto the paper if you're doing an abstract background. Tremendous for flower painting, and I use it a lot for that. And you can hold it above the surface of the paper and flick it like so, making sure it doesn't go on the curtains over there, otherwise I'll be in trouble with the boy. But when the paper's damp and you flick like that, it really spreads out beautifully. It's probably safer to do a much more controlled one and tap it on your hand like that. we can get this sideways movement of the brush, which hopefully might do the trick. So let's place the brush on here, get a little bit more foliage into this leaf area. So we're using the sort of heel of the brush You'll notice that I'm using the heel of the brush here and not the point too much, and I'm pressing that lightly on the paper and just letting it touch in places, and as a result the colour's coming off on the raised parts of this sort of rough paper, and it leaves you with this nice little speckly edge here, which is rather attractive, and it's nice and loose as well. The thing is to leave lots of gaps, and then it looks more interesting. Otherwise you don't really want these great big sort of puddiny chunks of foliage all over the tree, do you? You need to soak the brush in the paint when you're doing this sort of thing. Even though we want a fairly dry mixture, you can see I'm getting quite a lot of paint onto the brush, and then we can wipe off any surplus on a piece of spare paper. And now I can just touch in a little bit more colour here and there, just to strengthen it up, but I'm trying to keep it nice and light and fresh, and we just put the heavier strokes on the underside of the foliage, not all the way over, otherwise it's going to spoil the fresh look of the whole thing. While we've got that brush handy, we can use the same technique to pull out these nice rough patches on the grass. Very unusual brush stroke. As you can see, we're using the heel of the brush and pulling down like that with the handle more or less at right angles to the paper. When you're contemplating buying a medium round brush, it really is worth investing in a good quality Kolinsky sable, because it shouldn't be massively expensive and it's a good general purpose brush that has a wide range of uses. Let's just see how the brush operates for simple work. Like most of the brushes, we can hold it this way and paint a vertical stroke. We turn our hands this way up and we pull against the bristles for the upward stroke. And for a sideways stroke, obviously we can pull it across like so. Now if we want to do a finer line, we pull the brush to a point on the palette, and we can just hold our hand resting on the paper again, touch the tip on the paper, and you can get a very nice line. Rest the heel of the hand on the paper nice and firmly, pull it across like so. Now, like the squirrel brushes, this brush can produce thick and thin lines on a curving fashion, so for leaves and things like that we can do this simple way of pressing hard, releasing the pressure, all the time we try to encourage the brush strokes to be nice and smooth. Press hard, pull out to a thin point. If you want a nice thin line, you can just pull it out like so. So it's very good for things like flowers and plants. Any situation where you want a thick line or a thin line. Don't forget, if you want a thick branch running through there, you can go like so. So for rounded objects, we pull the brush round, get a nice curve. We try and let the bristles go their own way. For small objects, we can obviously press the brush on the paper and get little pebbles and things like that. For square things like buildings, we can easily do those because we can use the point of the brush, and then we can turn a hand round for this sort of lateral thing. Don't forget, don't try and do it from this position because you'll disturb the hair. So turn the brush round this way, and then you can get the nice square edge you want. So this is an ideal brush for painting in roofs on buildings. Because we can do nice fine lines like that. Turn a hand round, complete the roof, and then pull it across the palette to get a nice fine edge. And now we can paint in the other edge to the roof. And we shape the brush by pulling it across the palette like so. Now we can hold our hand like this because we've got a sideways movement to start with, and then we can gradually move our hand around and try and reproduce this nice curve on the bridge. Just even that up a touch. And underneath we can do the same thing, which should match roughly. In fact, let's carry it on round and we'll make the join in the most suitable spot. So to get that nice curve at the bottom, we either move our hand across this way and pull it that way, or we can move our hand around this way, put the point there and pull it that way. The thing is to get in a nice comfortable position, because so many people can't seem to paint right because they're frightened of moving the paper, frightened of moving their hand into position. And if you get into the habit of moving your hand round in these strange ways just to get the right angle, so you can pull it that way, you can pull it that way, you can pull it that way, upwards, downwards. Get used to the idea of moving your wrist and hand round and get in a nice comfortable position so that the hairs will move naturally, because every time you get in an awkward state you disturb the bristles, and that's when you get these funny dodgy lines. And it's particularly important on a thing like a bridge, because you need to get that nice even shape. I need to take out a little slither in the middle there, of course, to make it to make a dividing line. We'll do that in a second. So we've got there should be a little line about there, I think. So I'll pull that across with a slightly damp brush, and that creates a nice little dividing line and suggests a shadow under the bridge there. So let's put some little posts in on this little scene here. We can hold the brush slightly sideways, so we're actually disturbing the bristles because we want a rough effect. If we wanted a nice smooth one, we'd come down like this. And if we want a rougher effect, we turn the brush slightly sideways and we're going against the bristles. So this is where you can use the position of the brush to good effect. So we can put our connecting pieces of wood in. Try and keep these nice and random. vertical stroke, thin on here, now while that's still wet we can take an even stronger mix and just come in and spruce these things up a bit. That's when the movement of the brush creates a rough edge, which is rather nice because it doesn't look too even. We can show a little bit on the top of the pole there, and maybe slot in a few bits of weed hanging from the top, from the bottom rather. And then we can turn the brush over and put in a few little gritty bits around the bottom. Don't forget you can flatten the brush so it looks more like an oar, and that's quite a nice thing for putting little grasses and things like that in. I can use the thin edge that way and pop in little grassy pieces or little bits of weed hanging from the boards, or I can turn it that way and pull out some rough dry brush effects. This is an excellent brush for painting trees, especially winter trees, because we can hold the brush like that and we can pull up this nice vertical stroke, and then we can pull out the branches. Let's go up the other side this time, up, side, up. Let's go up the other side this time, up like that. Thick branch, gradually getting thinner, gradually getting thinner and thinner. Press the brush on the paper, pull it, pull it, pull it. You notice the bristles are going nicely because we are pulling them in a natural direction. If we pull it out here, say, and then try and go down there, you can see you splay the brush out and you get this wide branch which nobody likes, which is a problem, in which case we've got to thicken up the tree and make it look more natural, which is quite difficult to do. We'll just make that one thicker. So what we need to do is to pull the brush so that the hairs follow the handle, and then we can get these nice wiggly branches. As the paint runs out, you can get quite nice thin lines with this brush. So you don't necessarily need a very fine rigger to do these sort of things. You just need to let the paint virtually run out. Although the small round sable is a widely used and recommended brush, I tend to use the medium round for the larger items and the rigger for the smaller things, because you can get a much finer line with the rigger and it's easier to control, in my opinion. So I don't bother with the small round brush at all.
A long-haired rigger is a wonderful brush for painting fine lines of all kinds. It's essential to load it correctly and hold it at a suitable angle. Then it's easy to control. Most problems arise because people load this brush with too much paint or water and use it with a rigid pencil grip. Then, when a change of direction is needed, they pull it sideways so the smooth lines of the brush are upset and the bristles splay out. The brush is ideal for inserting fine detail, the small finishing touches that add sparkle to your painting.
This is where the rigger comes into its own. Nice little painter on the front of that little boat just to finish the picture off. And we mix up a nice strong dark mixture on the palette. So we can pull the brush across the palette to get that nice point on the brush. Now we can place the brush there, Take it gently into the water. Now we want it disappearing into the water there, don't we? And then it can meander at a touch of water, so we get a paler colour, and we're going to probably see a very faint suggestion of that in the water running up to a point somewhere below there.
Bristle brushes are not usually considered to be watercolour brushes, as they're normally associated with oils and acrylics, but they are useful for lifting out or lightening areas. This is best done while the paint is still wet, because it doesn't leave the surface looking overworked. But for long dried paintings, they can still be effective. Damp the area in question and allow the water to soak in thoroughly before attempting to lift out colour. Be careful so as not to disturb the paper surface, and allow the surface to dry a little before freshening up the paint with a gentle wash of new colour.
Same time we can put a little bit of foliage in using that same bristle brush. We hold that brush at an angle, fairly flat to the paper, and we can pull it in or out both ways. Leave a little bit of foliage running through the middle of the tree, just to add interest. You can hold the brush either that way, or you can pull it out that way. Note the angle, fairly flat to the paper. You might find this way a little bit easier. Now I can add a little bit more colour to this tree, taking care not to cover too much of it up. Leaving some nice light patches here and there for added interest. I can add a touch more glue to that mixture, and while it's drying in, just add a few little touches here and there. So we can just scrape out that those light trees using this palette knife. It's much more controllable than a credit card, and it's easy to bring out these sideways branches. So that's quite a useful little feature. Paint has to be almost dry but not quite, otherwise you get dark lines. Now we pull the palette knife across like this, and it makes these nice interesting shapes and leaves lots of little ridges. Glass paper hardly comes into the category of a brush, but it can be used instead of one. By rubbing the glass paper like this, you can get a nice sparkle on the water. And place the sandpaper in the horizontal position, tilt it slightly, and pull it carefully across, making a very fine line. If you want to make it stronger, just press a little bit harder. It certainly adds a little bit of sparkle to the picture, I think. Well, I think that's about it. Hope you've enjoyed all these different brush techniques. Let's just recap on a few things we've run through here. Don't forget to load your brush properly. Don't put too much water on. Put just enough pigment, keep the damp in the paper and take advantage of it. Don't put the brush to the paper if the paper surface is still shiny and too damp. When there's a gloss on the surface, leave it to settle in, because that can cause problems. Finally, use the bright brush, the correct brush strokes for the job in hand. So you shape your brush strokes to the thing you're painting. Hopefully you can enjoy your painting more now.